I'm so excited for today's chat. Let's explore the idea that you could be in an existential crisis and not even know it. I'm so excited to talk about this. So, let's dive into what an existential crisis is, what would be the symptoms, and while we look at a potential antidote, how could that tell us that you may be in one and not even realize it? This is an idea I've been thinking about quite a bit lately, just because I've been studying and exploring something called existential theory. Existential theory is a psychological philosophy, essentially, that was developed by Irvin Yalom back in the 80s, I believe. And it's this idea that we all have existential anxiety and despair around four aspects of life: death, freedom of responsibility, isolation, and meaninglessness. When we do not grapple with these unavoidable attributes of being human, then it can cause us existential anxiety and despair, and we actually attribute peripheral experiences to being the source of that anxiety or despair. So this idea is just super fascinating to me in many ways. I love the engagement of those four tenets. Those are four areas of my life that have hugely impacted me. When I was really young, I was 15 and a half in 2008, and I went through a stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma cancer, did 6 months chemotherapy. And that was kind of the beginning of these existential challenges that I faced at a really young age. Timeline of life kind of put on my peripheral, meaninglessness. I didn't know where I was going in life, what I wanted in life. That all kind of came to the surface. Isolation. I couldn't relate to people around me and my peers, and that was really difficult to reconcile. And then freedom of responsibility of freedom, where it's like, okay, what should I do? There's so many routes and choices that I could possibly make or align myself with, and there's something overwhelming about that and anxiety provoking about that. So I experienced all of that, kind of figured out a general direction as life went on. And then 2 years ago, right after I gave birth to our daughter, I was diagnosed with a rare and aggressive tongue cancer. I went through treatment summer of 2023 that was just horrible, and total physical suffering was a part of my life for an extended period of time, for like 2 months. And so far the treatment has been successful, but I came out of it, and praise be to God, and I came out of it really feeling a lot of fear about life, fear about death from the cancer coming back, and I didn't know how to grapple with that. So I went through this, what I see as being an existential crisis, and that has been going on really for the past almost 2 years. I feel like I'm just recently kind of coming out of it as of this past month or two. But I mean, anytime I would get a swollen lymph node or tension in my mouth or a weird sensation in my throat, it was this immediate fear that would come up, and this existential dread that would come up and I would have to grapple with, and it would put me in a funk for a couple days. And anyways, it was a real big catalyst to exploring a relationship with God and what that might look like. And that relationship with God ultimately became an antidote for me and has soothed a lot of that anxiety and fear around those four pillars that existential theory highlights. So we've kind of dove into a little bit about existential crisis and how that might show up in someone's life or how it might not show up in someone's life. So anybody may have concern or anxiety and despair in these four areas, but because they're not conscious of it, they may attribute that anxiety and despair to other experiences in life. that's really, really important to reflect on, even in your own life. If you have anxiety and despair around certain things, I'd encourage you to reflect on whether or not it's connected to death, isolation, responsibility of freedom, or meaninglessness. Existential theory doesn't propose like an answer to these challenges. They're just things that all humans have to grapple with, and by bringing more consciousness to it and intentionality behind our perspective on those four aspects of life, that's what can soothe this anxiety and despair. Now, through my experience, I have witnessed the biblical narrative be an antidote to the challenges that come up in these four areas. So when I say you might be in an existential crisis and not even know it, you may have what you see as surface level anxiety and despair, if the self-awareness is there to recognize those things. And they may actually be connected to something deeper. Perhaps there is a deeper sense of nourishment and fulfillment that you are actually seeking in life, a deeper sense of soothing that your current worldview isn't offering. The biblical narrative has impacted me so much because it's been like a set of glasses. And I have another video that's called Sacred Sight, but it's literally like, whoa, I look at the world differently now than ever before because of the ideas proposed in the Bible. And it has impacted me in the best way. So some examples of the Bible and the biblical narrative being an antidote to this existential crisis. Let's get into death. Physical death, bodily death here in this world is unavoidable. Everybody goes through it. There's only one being that ever conquered death and was resurrected from death, and that was Jesus Christ. And there's a lot of interesting information on that being true, and I highly recommend you look into it. But Jesus Christ speaks on there being more to life after we physically die in this lifetime that we know now. That's really powerful to reflect on, simply because there's a lot of information on what they call deathbed experiences and near-death experiences. So those are two separate things. Deathbed experiences are like people who are coming to the end of their life and they have visions, they see things, basically potentially see the other side, so to say. And then you have near-death experiences where people are like dead, flatlined, no brain activity or heart activity, and yet they report experiences of consciousness about their situation when they were flatlined. And then they have it, like I said, not only experiences of their physical body that others can kind of like account for as happening, but then they may also see visions of what some would attribute to be the afterlife. And it's interesting because these visions do align with the biblical narrative. And that's kind of fascinating when you see a harmony between what a man who is resurrected claims and what other people facing death and glimpsing at death may claim. That's just interesting to look at those parallels. So basically, it's like, yeah, you may die here and now, but there's more on the other side, right? This isn't it. This isn't all of it. And on the other side, the Bible even argues that if you're a follower of Christ and you are seeking that authentic relationship with God, then you will be on the other side with God. And if you're not, God's not going to force himself upon you. And so you won't have that experience of God on the other side, because that's your free will. That's your choice in this lifetime to seek that or not. God isn't going to impose himself on you. So that is an interesting antidote to this existential fear of death. I recommend you just, as we go through these, reflect on where your mind is and what your thoughts are around these ideas, these four pillars, and these biblical ideas. second, responsibility of freedom. And the biblical narrative actually is primarily centered around this idea of like putting your relationship with God first and foremost, prioritizing God, and ultimately surrendering your will to God's purpose for your life. And so there's this interesting balance of, yes, you have to make choices and take action in your life, but you should be asking, is God in Christ at the center of that decision? And if he's not, what would it look like to have that? And so there's just, it's something that we have to reflect on a moment-to-moment basis. The Bible does provide guidance, but it's not like a systematic if-then manual. What I mean by that is it isn't a list of, if this happens, then you do this. If this happens, then you do this. That's not what the Bible is. The Bible is saying, if this happens, you go to God. If this happens, you go to God. If this happens, you go to God, right? That's literally the entire book of the Bible in so many ways. Or it's, if this happens and you don't go to God, then this happens. Like, that's the Bible summed up from my perspective. But anyways, so responsibility of freedom, though, it kind of, when you start to think of life in that way, it kind of removes that sense of responsibility when it's coupled with this recognition that as you surrender to God, all things will be made good. All things will be put in alignment with God's purpose for your life. And even if you experience hardship and suffering, there will be a fruit to that challenge. There will be a greater goal, a greater purpose and meaning to that difficulty. That's really soothing to think about. So the third thing, isolation. Isolation, as posed by the existential theory, is this idea that like you don't have anybody else in the world that has the same perspectives and experiences as you do that have led you to where you are now. And because of that, there's this certain lack of relatability that everybody has on a very deep level. Now, we can relate to other people in the sense of like sharing different life experiences, anxiety, depression, cancer, death of a loved one, right? Being a mom, being a dad, having children, right? Like all of those things are like points of relation with other people. But we go through so many experiences that are unique to us that it kind of colors our perspective of everything, changes what we value, changes what we put our focus on, or how we see these different roles that we might be in or experiences that we may have. And that can be isolating in a way where it's like, no one gets me, no one understands all of these layers to who I am as a super dynamic person and what I've gone through. So that's existential isolation. And the biblical narrative is saying there is nothing that can separate you from God's love. There is nothing that can separate you from having this relationship with God through Christ, no matter what kind of physical threat and imminent danger you may be facing. And that's kind of powerful when you experience it. A lot of people misconstrue the Bible as, or a lot of Christians, they misconstrue a lot of Christians as being people who follow a narrative with blind faith. And there are people out there that do that. However, most of the authentic Christians I have come across, including what I would see as myself, has had some sort of authentic experience with Christ, meaning that when I pray and I meditate on God's character and what Christ has done for my life, and that's a whole thing that could be unpacked, but when I meditate on that, I mean, it brings me to tears. It is overwhelming and soothing and peaceful and evokes such a deep sense of security, and absolutely is an antidote to that sense of isolation where it doesn't matter if I relate to other people around me or not, because I have God and I'm focusing on being driven by God at my core. And so there's just a different soothing that comes from that. Now, the fourth pillar within existential theory is meaninglessness. And this is a challenging one in our culture, mainly because our culture is so achievement focused. Not only is it achievement focused, it is validation focused, representation focused. We in our culture are constantly seeking feedback from those around us and a stamp of approval that we are on the right path, or validation that we are on the right path. I think this is natural as humans from an evolutionary standpoint, because there's something really powerful about seeking community and aligning with the community. If you think into ancient cultures, right, it became a matter of survival. And this is the same even now in a modern culture, because connection nourishes us emotionally and psychologically and physically in so many ways. So I see that being a basis in a lot of cultures, is that search for community and validation from those around us. But what happens is our sense of meaning in life also becomes deeply shaped by that community. We live in a culture right now of a lot of excess, extra things, yet feel so much lack. And that is endlessly fascinating. We live in a world, especially if you're in the United States, where you can get so many different variations of the same thing that is tailored to your uniqueness, so that you can fill every void you might have in yourself, except one, which is God. There's only one thing that can fill that void, and it's relationship with God. Sorry, I keep moving. The sun is in my eyes. And so when it comes to this discussion of existential meaninglessness, we may put ourselves into circumstances where we're driven towards achievement and success and accomplishing what we may find valuable. However, there's still a deeper soothing that comes when we surrender our life to our Creator. Our Creator designed us for a very specific purpose and intention. And if we try to cut a relationship with God out of our lives, there's no way to know whether or not we are actually living our God-given purpose. In fact, the Bible argues you cannot live your God-given purpose fully without God involved and without Christ at the center. And this is something that I have experienced in my life, is that I've experienced a lot of great, fulfilling things in life, but it has never paralleled the fulfillment and the meaning that I have found in my life since surrendering my life to Jesus Christ. And that's a powerful thing to say and come to the conclusion of. When I used to be fully anti-Christian, I used to be a Buddhism, yogi-focused, New Age spirituality practitioner, and I would fight with Christians and argue with Christians because I thought the ideology was so ridiculous, and it was a lot of people that were just following blindly. And so it's really wild to be here and sit in front of you and make that claim outwardly. And I'm not saying that from an intellectual standpoint, although there's a lot of incredible evidence to manage skepticism, which I had to go through as well. However, I'm speaking from a place of experience, that once you experience the peace of Christ and the peace of God and the meaning and purpose that that narrative puts in your life and infuses in your life, nothing compares. And it's incredible. And I'm still along for the ride. I don't know how things are going to evolve in my life and where God is going to take me, but there's been these glimpses of experiences and insight that God has blessed me with that gives me some clues towards it. And the biggest one is just the sense of peace and soothing amidst the process. When I was in a very achievement-focused, success-focused mentality, it was really hard for me to feel settled. I had other things going on in the sense of feeling the timeline pressure of life weighed heavy on me. And there was also this deep sense of needing to create an identity for myself and be known, which very much ties into that fear of death, right? Not being forgotten. And so those were big driving forces behind the anxiety and the pressure that I felt to accomplish things and make myself valuable or be perceived as valuable and worthy. And now, as I have this antidote to these 4 things through the biblical narrative and through my faith in Christ, so much of that has been soothed. And now I can live my life, and I'm still moving forward and making choices and, putting effort into a certain trajectory in my life. However, there's a much deeper sense of peace and contentment that goes along with it. So with all of that said, it wasn't until I went through immense suffering that I started to realize I was in an existential crisis. And as I think about it, I think what was happening is I was always in an existential crisis. After that first cancer treatment, it started to kind of come more to the peripheral of my life and more to the forefront of my life. And there's just been these pressure tests that have made it more known and removed the veil between me and my recognition of these challenges. So when I say you might be in an existential crisis and not even know it, you may have these underlying anxieties and existential anxieties and despair, and because life is going okay for you, or you're not feeling a certain level of pressure in different areas of your life, you don't even realize what is bubbling under the surface. And that's crazy, because there could be one situation that you don't even know is going to happen and it just drops in your life, and you are just catapulted into this existential crisis. And that's what generally happens. And you go through these giant pressures that really bubble up these underlying concerns. So if you don't have God and Christ at the center of your life and perspective, you may be in an existential crisis unknowingly. Even if you claim to be a believer of Christ, if you don't have this biblical narrative and perspective really deeply in your heart, you may still have a potential underlying existential crisis just waiting underneath to bubble up. I hope that this gave you some food for thought to reflect on. Please comment below, reach out to me if you have any comments or questions. I'd love to continue a dialogue about this. It's hard with these videos because it's just me talking, and I would love to get feedback and hear what you have to think. So don't be afraid to reach out or comment below. With all of that said, I hope that you have an absolutely blessed day, and that this video offered some really deep and fruitful reflection in your mind and in your heart.